morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's so good to have so many. And this is a sold-out symposium, so you were lucky to be in the room. And I'm Betty Suchar, so if anything goes wrong, blame me. But we think we're ready to go. And some of you will know that this is the 200th anniversary of the Bath Royal Literary and Scientific Institution. So from 1824, we've been trying to do wonderful things in Bath, and particularly this year, and that's why we designed the Extraordinary Women Conference that we're having today. So I wanted to go over the schedule with you so you'll know what we're doing. So we're having our first talk, followed by a coffee break in the Duncan room. We'll come back and have our next talk. We'll then have an hour for lunch and then welcome back. And we'll have another talk followed by a documentary about Paula Rega. And then we'll have a tea again in the Duncan room, to which you're all invited. So it should be a lovely day. And so now let me present the person who's going to introduce the day for you and introduce our first speaker, and that is Anna Monet. And she is a writer, a curator, an art critic, and probably a lot more. So welcome, Anna.
Hey, thank you so much for having me here. Thank you, Betty. Thank you, Sandra, for asking me. It's a real honor. So yeah, I'm just here to basically set the scene. I've been working for 13 years as an art writer, critic, as Betty said, various things. And during that time, I've obviously thought and written a lot about women artists. At first, I used to get really annoyed when people would come to me and say, you know, oh, you're a woman, you'll write this, won't you? Oh. Talking to here. Yes, I used to get quite annoyed when people were kind of disingenuous and said, oh, you're a woman, you'll write nice things about these women artists. Sorry, I've been thrown now. But these days I react far less vehemently because yes, I am interested in women artists, and particularly with the special fights and battles and way of living that they have to face in this androcentric Western art history. So I still maintain that what interests me most is art, good art, irrelevant who it's by. And so I would certainly agree with Marina Abramovich when she says, I'm not a feminist artist. I am a woman, but I am not the woman artist. I'm just an artist. She goes on to say, I genuinely don't like titles which divide male and female. You know, my position of art is that we don't have male, female, trans, gay, lesbians, homosexuals, whatever the categories are. The art can be good art or bad art. That's it. That's the only category I respect. I think it's damaging for artists when they have feminist exhibitions. In my experience, when you talk about feminist exhibitions, you always have 2, 3 really good artists. Many of them are Sunday painters and not good. And the whole thing becomes not good. That said, her recent exhibition at the Royal Academy made the history for being the first, she was the first female artist to have the main galleries in the whole 255-year anniversary of the Academy as a solo show. And she did say, as the first woman, I have to deliver something which is even better than a man. Moreover, it's really shocking that Angelica Kaufmann, who was one of the founding members of the RA, has only just been given an exhibition. I think it opened last week. I was at the press. I'm sure everyone's familiar with the work of the Guerrilla Girls, an anonymous group of feminist artists devoted to fighting the sexism and racism within the art world. They formed in New York City in 1985, and I'm sure you'll have come across some of their graphics. Including this one, very tongue-in-cheek but impactful posters. I won't read through all of those, but it is quite worth looking up if you don't know it. More recently, although the Guerrilla Girls are still going, alongside their Can You Name a 5 Women Artists campaign, the National Museum of Women in the Arts in Washington have published some fairly damning statistics. So this is from research, it's from 2019, so it's not totally up to date, but I'm sure that things haven't improved much, if at all, since then. So out of 3,050 galleries in the Artsy database, 48% represent 25% or fewer women artists, 10% represent no women artists, and 8% represent more women artists than men. We also have the top 10 artworks by price and category at auction from 2019, and no category has more than 2 women artists represented. So the white is the men and the dark blue is the women. In the major US art museums, these are the proportions depicted. So as you can see, it's 75% white, white men. White women are just 10%, and then Asian men and Latino men and other women and demographic groups, even less. So 14% of all exhibitions at 26 prominent US museums over the past decade were of work by women artists, so just 14%. And this is a neat little visualization of some of these statistics that was commissioned by the National Museum of Women for the Arts. I just thought it's quite nice. Well, it's not nice, it's bad, but it shows it quite clearly. So I'm currently running a series of lectures on women artists through their words, and the same problems and challenges keep coming up. For example, this is Caroline Schneemann. My teachers always said, "You're very talented, but don't set your heart on art. You're only a girl." So she's a famous performance artist, if you're not familiar. That's one of her works from the 70s. Oops, sorry. And then Lee Krasner, who famously is known as the wife of Jackson Pollock, but was an artist in her own right. "I'm always going to be Mrs. Jackson Pollock. That's a matter of fact. But I painted before Pollock, during Pollock, after Pollock." Judy Chicago, she tells this shocking but all too common tale from when she was younger. "One man, an art critic, used to bring me paint and canvas, mention my work occasionally in his articles, and take me out to dinner. But then he would say in the middle of a discussion, 'You know, Judy, you're going to have to decide whether you're going to be a woman or an artist.'" Yeah, it would seem if there are no great celebrated women artists, that's because powers that be have not been celebrating them, not because they're not there. That's Joan Semmel, who's another fantastic painter. And Linda Nochlin, who wrote the seminal "Why Have There Been No Great Women Artists?" she said, "The fault, dear brothers, lies not in our stars, our hormones, our menstrual cycles, or our empty internal spaces, but in our institutions and our education. Everything that happens to us from the moment we enter this world of meaningful symbols, signs, and signals." And just going back to Judy Chicago, "The truth is that for centuries, women have struggled to be heard, writing books, making art and music, and challenging the many restrictions on women's lives. But their achievements have been repeatedly written out of history." This is the Guerrilla Girls again. They've repeatedly called out collectors, so the little letter on the left, and also critics. So these are all American critics, so don't worry, Jonathan, you're not included. But I think Jonathan, who I'm about to introduce, certainly wouldn't be included anyhow. And it's really positive to see a man championing women artists, especially Artemisia Gentileschi, who, if you don't know anything about her, I'm sure you will do by tea break. So, yes, so without further ado, let me introduce Jonathan. He's the art critic who's written for The Guardian since 1999. In 2009, do jump in if any of this is inaccurate. In 2009, he was judged for the Turner Prize, and he's also been a judge for the BP Portrait Award. He's written many books, including The Loves of the Artists, Art and Passion in the Renaissance. Sorry, just move down. Sensations, the British story of British art from Hogarth to Banksy, and most recently, Earthly Delights, A History of the Renaissance. But also, books on Tracy Emin and this little gem on Artemisia. So she's one of the first women to have had a professional career in the art world. And at particularly the time when it was expected that only men would make their mark. And her trials and tribulations have belatedly made her something of a heroine. So, yeah, I'm going to leave you to say everything else. But welcome, Jonathan.
Hi, hello. Right. Obviously, can you see the slide? It's visible, but is it possible to darken? Yeah, that'd be good. Yeah, that's nicer, isn't it? Okay, so I'm going to start in the middle, right with this painting, which was what made me fascinated by Artemisia Gentileschi, and I saw it again in January. This painting is in the Uffizi Gallery in Florence. It's a big painting. And if you've been to the Uffizi Gallery, or if I mean, it's the Uffizi Gallery in Florence. Well, for me, it's the temple of art because it's, for anyone who's interested in the Italian Renaissance, the Uffizi is just the greatest place. And it's also a place that's chronological. So you start with medieval artists like Giotto, and then you walk through and you see the Renaissance unfolding and you meet Botticelli. They have a whole room full of Botticelli, and then Leonardo da Vinci's Adoration of the Magi, Michelangelo, Raphael, Titian, yes, all male. But the big boys, as it were, of the Renaissance. And as I say, you start at the beginning back in the Middle Ages and you go through this huge place. And this painting was painted in 1620. So for the Uffizi Gallery, that makes it one of the last paintings in the whole collection that you get to. And by that time, you're knackered, your feet hurt. I mean, as I say, I actually did this again in January, and your feet hurt. You're just about keeping going on a quick lunch, and you come to this work. And it's stunning. And every time I see it, it's stunning and captivating and fascinating and, truly powerful. As I say, it's a big painting and it's a sensational and shocking painting. Call me crude, but I like sensational, shocking paintings. And this has always grabbed me. And I wish I could remember the first time I saw it because I've been to the Uffizi since I was a child. Basically fell in love with art there. So was it the first time I went when I was, I don't think, but certainly by the time I was a student, I was looking at this painting in the Uffizi Gallery. I was a history student, and anyway, went to Florence with my girlfriend, and who's my wife now. And we were fascinated by this painting. And also as a student, a book came out in the 1980s by the American art historian Mary Garrard, feminist art historian, and it's a remarkable book, this big book, Artemisia Gentileschi. And as a student who was very interested, a history student who was very into early modern history, early modern is the kind of term that historians tend to use for the whole period between like 1450 and 1800. So as I say, this was painted in 1620. Artemisia was born in the late 16th century, and she lived through to the mid 17th century. And she's born in the age of Shakespeare. She knew Galileo, they were friends. So she's at the heart of a very extraordinary period in European culture. But the point I wanted to make really about the Uffizi is not just personal. I like going to the Uffizi and looking at this painting, but you know, we're talking about the canon. It's always fascinated me about women in the Western canon of art, that this painting actually massively holds its own in the most extreme possible museum of the European canon that you can have. You know, it doesn't need any kind of special pleading or defenses to say, oh, well, you know, it's, but I mean, everything about it is terrific. Obviously, the technical skill is obvious. I mean, especially if you look at the face of the Serba. So I should tell you more about the painting. It's Judith and Holofernes. It's the biblical story of Judith and Holofernes. The Israelites were being attacked and besieged by an army led by this brutal and powerful general, Holofernes. And Judith volunteered to go on a mission. She made her way into the enemy camp, and she basically got to meet Holofernes and seduced him and got him drunk. And they have a kind of wild drunken evening, at the end of which he falls unconscious and she cuts his head off. And she takes it back to you know, to home. And this is, so she's a you know, she's a Jewish hero, and she's in the Old Testament, in the apocryphal books of the Old Testament. And it became it's a very powerful theme in art. What Artemisia does here is she shows, so on the figure on the right, on the far right, the one who's actually got the sword, that's Judith. The other woman is her servant Abra. And often Abra is usually portrayed as an old woman, and she appears not so much in this scene as in scenes of the two of them. She carries the head, she helps Judith to carry the head back with her after the murder. She's not usually shown, this is a totally original composition, in other words. No one had painted it in quite this way before. Nobody had shown Abra as a young woman and Judith as a young muscular woman. So you've got two young, actually quite strong, muscular, big-armed women, and they're, well, as you see, they're hacking this guy's head off. And Holofernes is awake. He's conscious. He knows what's happening to him. To add to the horror. Anyway, we'll talk more about it. But you know, so it's a very visceral, you know, absolutely gory rendition of this scene, but also weirdly realistic, because it showed, well, what would it really have been like? You know, how do you really do that? How do two women, you know, how does a young woman hack a man's head off? Well, maybe two women could do it. One to hold him down and one to hack his head off. So anyway, as I say, that Mary Garrard published a fantastic book about Artemisia in the 1980s. But what fascinated me about it was that it has a transcript of a trial that took place in 1612. Artemisia is not only a remarkable artist, and I think this is the most powerful painting that was done by a woman in early modern Europe, which, as I say, is the period from, you know, the late Middle Ages through to 1800. But she's not only a remarkable artist, we actually know quite a lot about her, an unusual amount, partly because of this trial transcript in which she speaks. It's recorded like a drama, you know, so what she actually said in this trial is recorded. So her own words are there, and she's there as a person, as a character, in real, you know, in her own words. Also letters. She wrote quite a lot of letters by her survive. There's a letter, you know, as I say, we know that she was friendly with Galileo, because one of a letter by her to Galileo survives. And then there's a whole new cache of letters to her lover, Francesco Maringhi, which appeared quite recently. So again, give you amazing insight, actually. So it's all that. And but the thing about this painting, well, what those documents give is access to actually sometimes quite horrific things that are more terrifying than the painting, in fact. Her life was brutal and difficult, and when you know the facts of her life, then that changes the nature of this painting. But as soon as you see it, even without knowing anything about her life, you see it, you look at it, wow, you know, this is a really powerful painting of two women killing a man, in a way that seems quite merciless as well. They don't show any particular remorse, or, you know, it's work, it's hard work, and they're doing it. It's a job that's got to be done. The man has to be killed. The theme of Judith was seen, I mean, it's a fascinating subject precisely because it, you know, it seems to show an inversion of the patriarchal social order that prevailed in Artemisia's day. And let's not, you know, this is 400 years ago, and a lot has changed in the last 100 years, especially, and it's still changing, you know, in gender relations. And so in Artemisia's day, women were not expected to have any kind of, the idea of a woman having a career was, you know, it just didn't compute. Women could be wives. I mean, we're talking about, you know, Italy in the early 1600s, women could be wives. That's what, you know, or they could be nuns. And that was basically the choice. A lot of women were nuns, of course, because in order to get your daughter married, you had to have a dowry, and sometimes to avoid paying the dowry, women were sort of siphoned off into nunneries instead. But the idea of a woman being a painter, it's totally miraculous, extraordinary. But the theme of Judith in this world, which was totally patriarchal, was a fascinating subject because it was, you know, an image of everything turned upside down. And in carnivals and festivals, they had the kind of the world turned upside down, you know, the woman ruling the man. That's an image of the world turned upside down. It was, and it fascinated them. And there's a sculpture by Donatello of Judith killing Holofernes, in which Judith stands above Holofernes, bringing down her sword. And that was in Florence, and it's still in Florence. In 1504, when Michelangelo's David had been made, Michelangelo had sculpted David, and there was a discussion in Florence among all the artists, including Botticelli and Leonardo da Vinci, where to put David. And, you know, one group were arguing for it to go where it actually did go, in front of the Palazzo della Signoria, the government palace, as a symbol of the government. And one of them says, well, the statue that's there now is Donatello's Judith. And, you know, it's the woman killing the man, and that's not right. So they were completely aware of the potential subversive nature of this theme. You know, and this debate over David, they're saying it would be much better to have a, you know, big naked man. That's a proper virile subject for the Republic. Whereas a woman killing a man, that's an unsuitable image for the Republic. So they know that this is a dangerous theme. And then you've got a woman doing it. So if you have a woman doing it, and she's doing it with this kind of passionate intensity, what the hell? It's quite, you know, it was a provocative thing to do, but it also fascinated them. And it was this painting, he did this painting for the Medici family, for the Dukes of Florence. And that's why it's still in the Uffizi Gallery. It's been in Florence for 400 years. So she had a market, she had an appeal. Now, let's see if I can go through these slides. Yes. Okay. The thing about this paint, about Judith and Holofernes, is it's a second version of the subject. She first painted it a few years earlier, in 1612. That's this version. And this version today is in the Museo di Capodimonte in Naples. And it's just as forceful, just as brilliant, but a bit rougher. It's a bit more rough and raw. It's been cut down a bit. It's been badly treated over the years. And what she did in the second version was to develop it and to enrich it and to just, you know, work on it more. One of the things she did in the second, if you look at this version, the blood is just flowing down flatly. Whereas in the second version, she shows it spurting up in a fantastic fountain. And I think that might have been influenced by Galileo, that the way she painted the blood in the second version is influenced by Galileo. But the raw passion of it is all here in 1612. And the story of how it was created and when it was created is revealed in the court transcript from the same year of the curial court in Rome, that in 1612, Artemisia's father, Orazio Gentileschi, brought proceedings against Agostino Tassi, a painter, for raping Artemisia. And so this trial was the trial of her rapist. And we have it all laid out. So this was painted, this vision of two young women killing a man, was painted just after she'd been raped by Tassi. I think it was I'm pretty sure it was painted between the attack and the trial. That it was, so it's in the heat of these events. That's when she paints this. So, the psychological intensity of it takes on a new dimension, I think. But also, let's start a bit before that with Artemisia. Who is Artemisia? How did she become? How did any woman become a painter in early 17th century Italy? Well, one thing is that Artemisia was basically a genius, and I'm not using the word lightly. She clearly had an extraordinary gift. Well, extraordinary women, she had an extraordinary gift for art. This is her first painting that exists, and this was done, well, it's dated 1610, when she was 17, which, and that makes her a genius, I think. A genius like Mozart or Raphael, somebody who really had just an unbelievable gift at what she did. We'll come back to this. We'll look at it carefully. It's a very powerful, it's obviously she's painting the nude. It's probably herself. She's probably used herself as a model in the painting in the mirror. Because what was the life of a girl in Baroque Rome like? All this copious trial document actually gives insights into what her daily life was like. Her daily life was basically, she was at home learning to paint in her father's house, or she was at church and on the way to church. That was basically her life. She didn't go to school. She didn't learn to read or write. She learned to read and write as an adult and became quite good at it. But she, as a child, she did not go to school. So it's all in the home and at church. This painting communicates, so she's probably painting herself in the mirror, but she's done it. It's a very radical and powerful interpretation. Again, this is a popular theme. Susanna and the Elders, another biblical story. These, the elders are voyeurs and they're spying on Susanna. And it became more and more popular with artists in the late 16th century, the age in which Artemisia is growing up. It's what's known as the Counter-Reformation. Basically, there'd been the Reformation in Italy. The Catholic Church had to get its act together because, it was under threat. And so it reformed itself. It became much more rigorous about certain things. And so as Italy's kind of becoming more Christian again, really, much more religious, the theme of Susanna and the Elders becomes popular with artists and presumably their clients, because it's kind of allows you to do the nude, which is one of the big things of the Renaissance, but it also allows you to have an ambivalence about it and to show that it's kind of, this is an ambivalent painting. On the one hand, she's painting herself nude and exhibiting, her body actually, and at the same time showing how horrible it is, for men to creep up and spy on her like this. you know, Tintoretto had done a similar, a very different way, but that same kind of sense of, you know, on the one hand, the Renaissance love of the naked body, on the other hand, the kind of the violence of voyeurism. But this is weird. There's nothing quite, again, she's totally original. There's nothing quite like this one, where the men are so close. This thing of the men being very close, and they're very creepy, as we would say nowadays. I mean, they're really creepy. They're kind of, you know, literally creeping up on her. And why is the older man? Why is one younger? They're supposed to be elders, but one of them actually isn't that old. He has black hair. He's younger, you know, more like in his 30s. And then there's an older man, and the older man is, you know, saying shh, saying don't say anything. It's very weird. It's very weird, and we'll come back to it. But so okay, she's a genius, but nevertheless, she had to learn skills. And this is the reason there are so few women artists in the Renaissance or Baroque ages, or indeed, you know, long after that, actually. It was because you had to learn skills. They didn't have any concept. Obviously, the Renaissance, it's the era of, you know, Raphael. They had no concept of an outsider artist, or, you know, someone a self-taught artist. You know, that's a modern idea. That idea that, you know, the art could be primitive or self-taught or anything. You know, art was a skilled activity, a highly skilled activity. And it was regulated by guilds. And it was taught through the apprenticeship system. So if you wanted to become an artist in, you know, Renaissance Florence, or, you know, and anywhere else, you had to become an apprentice. That's what happened. Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci, all these people, they were apprentices, and it was the same as any other medieval craft. You lived in the master's house along with other apprentices, and that was your education. You were learning, you know, you were living with an artistic master, learning the skills, and then eventually you would graduate to be a master yourself, and then you would have apprentices. That's how it worked. That was a completely male system. There was just no, you know, it would be a wild historical novelist who imagined a female apprentice in that system. It just wasn't conceivable. So women had to find other way. Any young woman who was going to become an artist had to find another way. And the most common way was if you were the daughter of an artist. And this is a painting by Artemisia's father, Orazio Gentileschi. And Orazio Gentileschi was a very, very skillful artist. And he's, you know, some people absolutely love Orazio Gentileschi. I think one of the reasons that I've always sort of championed Artemisia is that I find Orazio a bit boring. I've never suffered from the problem of revering Orazio Gentileschi. This is a painting. This is a late work by him, actually, and it's in England. It's in Hampton Court. You might have seen it in Hampton Court. It's a big painting, and it's Joseph and Potiphar's wife. But I mean, it's interesting. You can see. I think you can see the similarities. Although, yeah, I mean, you can see the similarities, but you can also see what Orazio's got, this incredible, almost clinical realism. If you told me this painting was done by a Victorian artist in 1870, I'd believe you, because it looks as if it was done in the age of photography. It's got that kind of quality, as you know, that you get in some Victorian 19th century paintings, where they've seen photographs, they're influenced by the camera, and at the same time they're dressing people up in medieval costumes. But no, this was done in the 17th century by Orazio Gentileschi. So you can see the stylistic similarities, and I could, you know, I think I was looking, you know, afresh before doing this talk. I think possibly I've tended to downplay. I suppose I was so keen to say, because you get people, you've had people. There has been some amazing, you know, I hate to use the word misogyny. Well, you know, misogynist. I mean, there'd been some of the denials of Artemisia have been very odd. Get people saying, "Oh, Orazio did her works," or she was just Orazio. She was just a kind of, you know, minor pupil of Orazio. Kind of all kinds of ways of belittling her. So I tended to kick against that by saying, as I say, I genuinely don't find Orazio very. I felt him a bit soulless myself, but clearly he's a very skillful painter, and clearly he did influence her. Well, he taught her. He taught her the rudiment. He taught her how to paint. I've now made a mistake. What have I done? Just want to go back to the. Yeah, that's it. Thank you. Okay, next image. Right. Now, the thing is about Orazio. So I'm just checking the time. So, okay. We finish at 11:15, don't we? So, yeah, and I'll leave time for talk. Anyway, so Orazio, the really interesting thing about Orazio, the really fascinating thing about him is that he was close friends with the truly most exciting artist of early 17th century Italy, Caravaggio. This is a painting by Caravaggio. Caravaggio, born in northern Italy, came to Rome, turned up in Rome kind of unannounced in the 1590s, starts painting pictures of well, I think of male prostitutes. He's basically pictures of male prostitutes with baskets of fruit, very, very intensely provocative works. Painting, and his painting of Bacchus, for example, Bacchus is offering you a glass of red wine, and he's naked, except he's got a kind of sheet over him, and that's held on by a black ribbon. But actually, when you look at the painting, and that's in the Uffizi. So again, I looked at it just recently. You know, he's actually undoing the black ribbon around his robe. In other words, he's offering you, you know, and some people try to argue that's an image of Christ, but to me, it's an image of the devil. You know, and so Caravaggio, he's a really dangerous artist. This is a kind of slightly dull time in Italian art when, you know, the Renaissance was over and there'd been this religious revival, and a lot of art is quite cloying and boring and religious and pious, and Caravaggio comes along. So what they did, but then he was, you know, he was taken up by a cardinal, and he was then encouraged to do religious art, and he became the most successful religious artist in Rome, because that's what they were, you know, that's where the commissions were. So he did fantastic religious works in the churches of Rome, but he was also, but those are edgy as well, incredibly edgy. I mean, this is a religious work actually. It's a painting of Mary Magdalene. It's supposed to be Mary Magdalene. Does it look like Mary Magdalene? Well, it looks like what it is, which is obviously a portrait of a young woman. But Caravaggio lived a low life. He was hanging out with male prostitutes and female prostitutes. She's probably a prostitute, sex worker. Sorry. And you know, those are his models, and street kids and urchins. I mean, one of the things about Caravaggio is if you look at his paintings, and I once did a thing for The Guardian where I went all around Europe looking at his paintings and looking at every single one. They all have filthy fingernails. Everyone has filthy fingernails, filthy toenails, because they're people of the streets. You know, and he lives on the edge, and he was always in fights. He was always getting into fights. He was always being accused of petty crimes. He was even accused of stealing a carpet, which sounds like something out of The Godfather, you know, Godfather. Anyway, so he's a thug, a criminal, outrageously gay as well, but he's also Rome's top religious artist, and it's all because of this radical realism. And I said, so Orazio Gentileschi was, you know, kind of his best friend, and we know this because, again, it's a trial. They went around libeling, putting up libels in the streets, poems satirizing another artist called Baglione. And they're saying he was, you know, your paintings are shit. Oh, sorry, you know, that's what they're saying basically in these verses. And so he got really annoyed, took to trial, but he provoked it because Caravaggio had done a painting, not a religious painting. He'd done basically a painting of Cupid, which is it's an adolescent, male youth, naked except for these strap-on wings, it's his most, is to call it provocative. I mean, it's just a shocking work of art. And Baglione had responded to it with a painting called Sacred Love, because that was profane love. Caravaggio had done profane love. So Baglione did Sacred Love, in which he shows an angel separating Caravaggio from his catamite. He's, you know, Cupid is being saved from Caravaggio's unwanted attentions. So he's accusing Caravaggio of sodomy and more. And so they responded with these poems. So Caravaggio and Orazio Gentileschi were on trial together for libel, and they, you know, and there's a record of it and what they said and everything. And it comes through. Orazio's strong affection for Caravaggio actually comes through really clearly. Not so much what Caravaggio thought, because he's just like, because he's such a crook. So when he talks, his voice, you know, he's just sort of, he's very terse. He's like a criminal in the dock. And he's a habitual criminal. This is another, but Caravaggio actually had a really, I've deliberately chosen paintings of women by Caravaggio. This is one that, as we'll see, influenced Artemisia. This is his painting of Saint Catherine, who was, she's got the wheel, because basically the pagans tried to kill her. They made a special machine, this wheel, and she was going to be broken on a wheel, but the wheel broke and she survived. You know, this kind of, so it's typical kind of story of martyrdom and survival. But very powerful. You see her finger on the blade, on the sword blade, and there's blood on the sword blade as well. And this is a real Caravaggio thing, you know. He loves swords. But he would have. So what I need to get back to Artemisia. I'm getting carried away with Caravaggio. He wasn't a man. It wasn't a woman. I mean, sorry, he was a man. And the thing is that, okay, but I see Caravaggio as Artemisia's real teacher. I mean, technically, undoubtedly, Orazio taught her the technical rudiments of art, definitely. But the emotion of her art, the feeling of her art, the passion of art, what makes her art so powerful comes from Caravaggio. And Caravaggio inspired a lot of followers. In fact, Orazio Gentileschi was his first follower. In this trial document, it actually says that it was Caravaggio and his friends and followers. And he had a lot of followers, and he inspired many, many artists. And because he's doing something so new, he's breaking the barrier between art and life. It's whereas Orazio's realism looks a bit like Victorian realism. Yes, it looks a bit like the real world. Caravaggio's art feels like the real world. It bursts out of the canvas. It's in your world. And this is, I think, what Artemisia learned from him. She also learned something more from him, because this is Caravaggio's Judith and Holofernes. So Artemisia's Judith and Holofernes is very much a response to Caravaggio's one. And you can see how much, you know, how that key thing, the key idea, of course, being that Holofernes is alive. He's still alive when his head is being cut off. It's a nightmare. It's a Caravaggesque nightmare. This, you know, this, to be alive when your head is being cut off. I mean, this horrible, macabre thought. You're dead and yet alive. It's, you know, he's dead and yet alive. The big difference, though, there are differences. I mean, first of all, I'm very keen not to sort of say, oh, Artemisia's puts Caravaggio in his place or something like that. What he's doing is different. I mean, the big question is how this happens, you know, how she cuts, how can this man be alive and conscious, and he's a big, strong man, while he's having his head cut off? And I think what Caravaggio is suggesting is that he's under some kind of spell. It's like an enchantment. And as you can see, Abra, the servant here, is an old woman, but maybe even a witch-like woman. And so it's as if this is it's a nightmare. It's a nightmare moment that, you know, is slightly unreal. But it's also, Caravaggio is very interested in Judith and what Judith thinks. He's interested in women. I think you know, it's arguable that Caravaggio is a great feminist artist. And, you know, so, but obviously his Judith, it's like a Shakespearean moment. She's actually tormented by the horror of what she's doing. She's seriously, she's troubled. She's like, somebody, she's recognizing the enormity of death, of killing. Artemisia, I don't know where Artemisia saw this, but she obviously saw a lot of Caravaggio. She grew up with Caravaggios all around her in churches. And she clearly is responding to this. But obviously, she does something different. She makes it more realistic. She must have seen this and said, well, yeah, but why is he just accepting this? Why doesn't he getting up? How have they done it? And how is she only holding the sword in one hand? Is that even realistic? What would it really take to kill a Holofernes? And her painting is much more brutally realistic because, there's two women holding him down. And this is another artist who had a big influence on Artemisia Gentileschi's life, but in a bad, horrific way. This is a painting by Agostino Tassi, the man who raped her. And Tassi's art is quite gentle. It's kind of scenes like this, landscapes and maritime scenes and architectural scenes, and he was in a lot of demand to paint frescoes in Roman churches. His pupil, he wasn't rubbish, because this is a view of Rome by Claude, the great French landscape painter. But when Claude came to Italy, he was actually Tassi's pupil and servant. Anyway, Tassi. So it's often said that Tassi was hired, was hired as a teacher for Artemisia. That's actually not true. That's just something that he claimed in the trial, and it doesn't stand up to the other evidence in the trial when you look at it closely. He was a friend of Orazio Gentileschi and may have replaced Caravaggio in Orazio's thoughts, maybe even, that he thought they were similar, because Caravaggio, in 1606, Caravaggio killed a man in a tennis match. He didn't kill him with a tennis ball. It's just they got into a fight they got into a fight in a piazza in Rome, and Caravaggio stabbed him with his sword. As he'd been building up to this all his life, as I say, being in lots of fights, and then he finally kills someone. And actually, it's the wrong person to kill because this man was well connected. Caravaggio had to flee Rome, so he fled Rome to southern Italy. He went to Malta, he went to Sicily, he went to Naples, and he died in sort of exile from Rome. He died down there in the south. He never. So by the time of he's basically dead by 1610, I think. And Tassi had a similar personality to Caravaggio's, or maybe seemed that he was loutish, and he was a Caravaggesque in the sense of being a thug. He'd murdered his wife in Tuscany, which eventually came out in the trial. There's kind of a bit of a damning piece of evidence against him, obviously, when this emerged. So he was really not a good person. And anyway, so as I say, a simple way of telling the story would be Tassi was her art teacher, but he abused her and raped her. There's a trial. It was much weirder than that. There was another person involved. So Orazio is a bit naive in his friends. This Tassi is a really bad character. And there's another guy called Cosimo Quali, who was quite powerful. He was a quartermaster in the papal palace. So he had quite a well-paid bureaucratic functionary in the papal palace, and he and Tassi both basically started stalking and harassing Artemisia, who's spends most of her time at home painting. She's learning, teaching herself to paint or being taught by her father. She spends a lot of time just in her room at home painting. But they start harassing her, and they start coming round and sort of suggesting taking on trips to various churches and places around the city and propositioning her basically. And there's a woman who's involved who's kind of almost pimping Artemisia to them as well. The thing about that is, if you go back to this painting has a date on it, 1610. I think it must have been painted in 1611 or finished in 1611, because I think these elders have to be Tassi and Corley. That's why one of them is younger, that the one with black hair is Tassi. And the older one, this older creepy guy, is Corley, because that was really what was happening, that they were being, they were pushing themselves on into her company, and they were, this is a powerful psychological rendition of what's actually happening to her. Under her father's nose, her father is very naive and doesn't know any of this. He doesn't know what's going on. And she returns to that in later paintings. It haunts her, these two voyeuristic elders. And then what happened after this, this weird, creepy behavior by these men, is that Tassi eventually comes round to her house one day when she's painting. He says to her, "Don't paint so much, don't paint so much." This is recorded. This is what he said. It's in the trial transcript, was what she said he said. "Don't paint so much, don't paint so much," throws her paints aside. And then he makes her walk around the room with him. He's very agitated. He makes her walk around the room with him. And she's saying, "What we do walking around the room?" And then he drags her into the bedroom. He pushes her into her bedroom, and he pushes her down on the bed. This is how she described it. It's quite graphic, extremely graphic. I'll try and, but he pushes her down on the bed and holds her down. She's very explicit about this. So he held her down, and then he's raping her. She fights back. She scratched him. She scratched him badly. And then she found a knife, and she actually threw a knife at him, which only kind of grazed him. Now, I think when you read these, actually, I say I'm putting it politely, the physical details, but when you read the horrific, what happened, I just can't separate it from the painting. That she is, this painting, her Judith and Holofernes, is dealing with that trauma, because she's actually literally reversing what happened to her. It's very clear that, she's very clear that he's a big man who physically held her down in order to rape her. In this painting, Judith and her servant physically hold, they reverse, they turn that upside down. She gets her revenge in the painting because they hold him down. They hold Holofernes down, and they hold him in place. How do you kill a man? Well, you're going to need two strong young women. One holds him down, the other uses the sword. And as you see, it's realistic how she uses the sword as well. It's like she's really planning how to do this for real. This is the Caravagesque revolution in art of being absolutely real, not realistic like a photograph, but real as in the room now. And not only that, but the first version of the painting, the first version that she did in 1612, she actually appears to have given it to Tassi at one point. So it's like she's, this is what, it's absolutely entangled up in the horror of these events. And in the trial, eventually, Tassi was convicted, although all kinds of slanders and malign gossip flew around in a way that totally shamed Artemisia and made it hard for her to live down. But he was convicted, partly because, well, not partly, in order to get a conviction, she had to undergo torture. He was not tortured, she was tortured. Because the judges did want to believe. They were obviously did think she was. They sort of believed her, but for a young woman's, you know, an 18-year-old woman's evidence to be accepted against a man in, you know, Baroque Italy, she'd have to undergo torture, and she knew this, and she was prepared for it. And she said yes. So she went round. When I say a trial, we picture it as in a court. You know, there's a trial going on in a court with a courtroom and everything, and that's how people actually, when people dramatize it, that's how they do it. But in reality, Tassi was in prison, and he was interrogated in prison, and she had to go to the prison. So she goes to the prison, and that's where she was tortured. And she was tortured with it was known as the Sibylle, where ropes are tightened around your finger. A rope is sort of coiled around all your fingers, and then it's gradually tightened, crushing your fingers. She's a painter. How hard is it for women to become painters? Well, it doesn't help if they smash your fingers, does it? And this is a self-portrait. I mean, it's not so. It's a painting of Saint Catherine, but which is also clearly a self-portrait. And if you look here, she puts a lot of emphasis on her fingers, and they look a bit kind of crooked, as if you can see kind of knobbly. They're a bit knobbly, the knuckles. So I think she's showing herself here as someone who has survived torture. During the trial, she was tortured, and she kept repeating. A judge asked her, "Is it true what you said?" And she says, "È vero, è vero, è vero. It's true, it's true, it's true." And she repeats this many times. And even the clerk sounds like, you know, he's quite astonished and moved by this, that she says, "È vero, è vero, è vero." And because of that, Tassi was convicted, but he was never punished. He was basically not punished. Because why? Because his fresco painting was actually quite useful to the popes. This is the time when all the great new Baroque palaces, Rome is being transformed. There's frescoes all going on all over the place, you know, like you see. And Tassi, you know, he had his uses, and so basically eventually he was pardoned, in fact. Even though he'd also murdered his wife and was living in incest with her sister. Anyway, it was all finished. But Artemisia survived, as she shows in this painting. You know, she survived. She went to Florence. Her family came from Tuscany, from Florence. So what they arranged for her to, you know, Orazio arranged they basically found someone to marry her, which was a way of, well, obviously, basically, had lots of economic purposes, because women weren't allowed to really engage in any kind of business dealings, or even buying paints would have been difficult without a husband. That, you know, so she married a guy who was completely useless, called Stiotesi. He was basically unemployed. And they were living first off her dowry, but then off her artistic career. But they did go to Florence, and Orazio wrote a letter to the Medici saying, "My daughter's a genius." The Medici did employ her as a court artist, and she lived there a few years. But she had several children while she was in Florence. She became a member of the. Sorry, excuse me. She became a member of she was the first woman ever to be enrolled in the Florentine Academy of Design, which had been founded by Giorgio Vasari, and was, you know, one of the first. It was the first Academy of Artists, and she was the first woman enrolled in it. And but then she also got into. The thing is, these letters, especially the ones that have been discovered recently, show that it's kind of chaotic. So she was married, but she had a lover, who was kind of upper class Florentine, called Francesco Maringhi. And Maringhi actually was the kind of love of her life, because their relationship, it was quite a sophisticated relationship, and it started, well, sophisticated in the sense that her husband knew about it. So he was a kind of willing cuckold. But her letters to Maringhi go on after, for really quite late into her life. So their relationship continued. And So she was also friends with Galileo, but she got into tremendous debts and difficulties, eventually had to kind of flee Florence. And the painting, the second version of Judith and Holofernes, which is in the Uffizi, that was done, she probably did it back in Rome just after falling out with the Medici. It was the last work she did for the Medici. And why does she redo this visceral work? Well, for me, it has to be partly because she's reenacting the trauma and the agony and the rage. And she's somebody, she definitely, this is early modern Italy, vendetta, people believed in vendetta. Artemisia kind of acts like a man. She doesn't accept that women, you know, can't do what men can do. She just doesn't accept the rules of her age. So she talks about her talent, my talent. She's, you know, she wants her talent. She absolutely believes that she's a talented artist who, you know, has an artist who deserves a career and deserves to be famous. She does allegories of fame. She gets famous. And this is another of her versions of Judith and Holofernes. Well, sorry, Judith and a maidservant with the head. Again, Judith and her maidservant with the head. So she keeps doing this theme. And she keeps doing Suzanne and the Elders as well. But she was famous, as I say, she absolutely thought she deserved to be a famous artist. She was talented, you know, but she also believed she had the right to revenge, which is, you know, just like men in this culture, men took revenge, vendetta was something, you know, and she talks in her letters, she talks about taking revenge for a trivial row that she had with somebody. So obviously, if she wants revenge for that, you know, I think she wanted revenge on Tassi. And there also seems to be an incident in which her husband tried to shoot Tassi with an arquebus and missed, unfortunately. This is in Florence. This is a beautiful nude that she did in Florence on the ceiling of the Casa Buonarroti. It actually would be even more beautiful, except that these draperies were added after her death. You know, like they were bowdlerized later on. And the Casa Buonarroti have done a digital reconstruction of what it would look like without the draperies, but they haven't, you know, they haven't removed the draperies. They obviously think that'd be too brutal. But it's got a star there at the top. I think it's full of it's part of a ceiling to honor Michelangelo that was commissioned by his descendants. But I think it's also an acknowledgement of Artemisia's fame too. So Artemisia has been recognized as someone who's worthy of going in of doing a painting in the Casa Buonarroti, you know, worthy of being compared with Michelangelo himself, which, by the way, is true because that first painting, Suzanne and the Elders, the nude, is actually, the pose is modeled on one of the male nudes in the Sistine Chapel by Michelangelo, and she was living around the corner from St. Peter's. So Michelangelo is an influence on her as well as Caravaggio. But she was famous. She did have fame. She had a very difficult, it was very difficult for her to make money, very difficult for her to, you know, she might have been too tempestuous as well. She didn't, you know, she couldn't stay in Florence. She couldn't get herself ensconced as a court artist in Florence. After that, she's very much working for the market. I think women artists in early modern Europe were pioneers of the art market, of working for the art market, because that was the only way they could survive. And so Artemisia becomes someone who she sells her art. But this was done by a French artist. It's the right hand of Artemisia Gentileschi. So one of these French artists who were living in Rome did this drawing of her hand because she was celebrated, she was famous. And she did, you know, a rich variety of interesting paintings like this. This is based on a comic play. I love this one because this is in the Prado. I mean, this is an insight into the real, I mean, the fact that she's a woman, she gives this is, you know, the birth of John the Baptist, but of course she's showing what birth was actually like. The birth room would be an all-female chamber where women were gathered and they're chatting, and, you know, it's a female scene. But it was a very difficult and slightly ragged existence. And then something new happened, something dramatic happened, that she was invited to a court to be a court artist. She was invited to England, to the court of Charles I, who was the most enthusiastic art patron and collector in Europe at the time. You know, Charles I was obsessed with art. He collected huge amounts of Italian Renaissance art, you know, basically brought high art to Britain in a way that led to him getting help to get his head cut off, because this was the age of Puritanism, and people weren't really so impressed that all these Catholic artists were coming to Britain. And one of the Catholic artists, well, in fact, the main Catholic Italian artist who actually went to Britain and worked for Charles I was Orazio, Artemisia's father. This is a drawing of Orazio Gentileschi in London that was done by, it's by Van Dyck. Van Dyck was, you know, big artist at Charles I's court. He did this drawing of Orazio Gentileschi, who looks an absolute miserable old sod at this point. I don't, but Orazio, he was working in London. He was doing work especially for the Queen Henrietta Maria in the Queen's house in Greenwich. And his sons, I forgot to mention Artemisia's brothers. She had, you know, she had brothers, but none of them had any talent for art or anything else. And they were basically kind of unemployed wastrels, and they were living off Orazio in London, and, you know, hatching various schemes. But then Charles I obviously learns about Artemisia presumably from Orazio, and writes to Artemisia inviting her to go to London, and she went. And it was a brilliant moment when she sort of recovers the genius of her youth. And it wasn't only Orazio who was in London, but Caravaggio. Caravaggio was dead, but some of his paintings were in London, including this one, which is one of his absolute greatest works, and which she'd probably seen in Rome when she was a child, but it's the Death of the Virgin. Very shocking. But in this moment in London, she discovers, you know, the real fire of her creativity, and she does this painting, which is still it's in the Royal Collection. And this is self-portrait as the allegory of painting. It's based on, you know, the painting in allegory uses female figures. All these kind of allegorical images tended to be female. So it's painting. She's personifying herself as painting. Is it a self-portrait? Well, people point out that actually she didn't have black hair, and by this stage she was older. But to me, it's an idealized herself as painting. It's also something else. It's her merged with Caravaggio. This is the figure on the right is Caravaggio's self-portrait in his painting "The Taking of Christ" in Dublin. Even the way, see the way he's holding up the lantern, where his hand is. There's a weird echo in Artemisia's allegory of painting. So I think in this moment of, I don't know, kind of obviously painting her heart out in London, she fuses herself with Caravaggio in this great painting. And she paints herself again. She paints herself into the canon. She paints herself among the greats of European art. And I think today she's rightly getting the full recognition of one of those greats. Thank you.